What if the final legacy of Queen Elizabeth II wasn't a crown or a title, but a condition, a test from beyond the grave that threatened to tear the royal family apart all over again? Because just 2 minutes ago, King Charles discovered something hidden deep in the Queen's personal effects, something that wasn't meant to be read in the presence of press or courtiers. Not yet. Not this soon. It was supposed to remain sealed for years, hidden behind the marbled walls of Windsor, protected from leaks, gossip, and the chaos of family tension. But fate had other plans. And now, everything has changed. A clause. A handwritten clause. Not typed. Not formal. Not wrapped in ribbon protocol. But emotional. Deeply personal. And devastating. Buried within the Queen's will was a sentence. Just one. That could freeze the entire inheritance of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. One sentence that threatens to hold their future hostage. Unless they reconcile with the very people they've spent years criticizing, alienating, and, some say, betraying. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Does this sound like something the Queen would do? Or is this the final thread of a monarch desperately trying to stitch her family back together, no matter the cost? And here's the twist. King Charles isn't playing along. "I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance," he said, his voice trembling. "I cannot accept this." So now, we're left with a question. A royal dilemma. A family test that no crown, no title, no amount of gold can solve. And that question is this. Should love ever be conditional, even if it's written by a queen? Stay with us, because this story is far from simple. It's not just about money. It's not just about the monarchy. It's about family wounds so deep, not even time or a billion-dollar inheritance can heal them. Or can they? Because what Charles found was just the beginning. For years, the British public believed that Queen Elizabeth's will was locked tight, just as it had been for centuries. Royal wills aren't like ours. They're sealed, protected by court orders, and kept hidden for 90 years. That's 9 decades of silence. But what the world didn't know was that Elizabeth, in the final weeks of her life, made a change. A personal one. She added a handwritten codicil, an emotional note, scribbled in her Balmoral writing desk just days before her health visibly declined. Witnessed only by her most trusted private secretary and sealed with her monogrammed wax stamp. No palace lawyers. No cameras. No press release. Just a message for her family and a condition for her grandson. The clause reads, "Should my grandson Harry and his wife Meghan wish to claim their inheritance, they must first make meaningful peace with the Prince of Wales and his father, the King. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children." That was it. A single sentence that carried the weight of 1,000 headlines. And it was no coincidence that the Queen chose the word children. Not Charles, not William, but Archie and Lilibet, the great-grandchildren she barely got to know. This wasn't political. This wasn't protocol. This was personal. And yet, what makes this clause even more shocking is the timing. Because it was dated just 2 weeks before her death. And the emotional undertone? Devastating. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. A grandmother's final attempt to heal something she feared would remain broken long after she was gone. But Charles, now King Charles III, isn't so sure that healing can be commanded, especially not from a will. "I cannot be the prize my sons fight over," he allegedly told a close confidant in Clarence House the moment he read it. "I won't let her final words become a weapon." And so now, the royal family finds itself teetering between duty and heartache, loyalty and leverage. Because the moment that clause came to light, something else happened, something no one expected. The money stopped moving. According to sources within the Palace Finance Office, a substantial portion of the Queen's personal fortune, believed to be set aside for Harry and Meghan's children, has been frozen. Not out of spite, but because the Queen made her intentions clear. And now, no one dares contradict them. That includes private estates, trust funds, and a series of discreet financial gifts rumored to have been promised to Meghan and Harry years ago. But now, that door is closed. Until they reconcile. But what does reconcile even mean? Does it mean a photo op? A handshake at the next coronation? A Christmas card signed with slightly warmer regards? Or does it mean more? Real forgiveness? Public accountability? Private apologies for a public war? Because let's not pretend this started yesterday. We all remember the interviews, the Oprah sit-down, the Netflix documentary, the memoir. Each chapter, each soundbite, was another brick in the wall between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family. And now, ironically, the very woman they've largely spared from criticism, Queen Elizabeth, is the one potentially placing the final hurdle between them and their inheritance. But here's where things get even murkier. Some insiders believe the Queen never intended this clause to become public, that it was meant as a symbolic gesture, a private encouragement, not a public barrier. But the clause was discovered, and once it was read aloud by King Charles in a private meeting, everything changed. The lawyers got involved. The family grew tense. And Meghan? According to sources, she was absolutely blindsided. Which raises another question. Did she ever truly expect to receive anything from the Queen? Or had she already written off that part of her royal past? Because while Harry may still carry fragments of attachment to the Windsor legacy, Meghan has made it clear. She's moved on. So when news of the clause hit Montecito, reactions weren't just mixed. They were divided. Some say Harry was quiet, pensive. Others claim he was furious. And Meghan? According to a friend close to the couple, her response was short. "I told him we shouldn't go back," she allegedly said. Even if they dangle the crown. But what if it's not the crown being dangled, but their children's future? Because Archie and Lilibet weren't mentioned by name in the Queen's formal will. But this clause, this final, emotional note, references them directly. It's not about money. It's about legacy. The kind of legacy that spans generations. The kind of legacy that builds schools, charities, foundations. The kind that opens doors in royal circles or closes them permanently. So now, Harry and Meghan face a decision. Not just whether to forgive, but whether to surrender. To reconcile not for love, but for leverage. And Charles? He's caught in the middle. Between his mother's dying wish and his son's cold silence. He could override the clause. He could release the funds. He could end this drama in a heartbeat. But he won't. Because even if he doesn't agree with the Queen's condition, he refuses to undermine her final words. She believed they could come back, Charles reportedly told an aide. She believed love was still possible. Who am I to say she was wrong? But then he added quietly, if only she knew how far we'd already fallen. So what happens now? Will Harry swallow his pride for the sake of Archie and Lilibet? Will Meghan reconsider her stance for the chance to finally secure her children's royal inheritance? Will William even accept an apology? Or is this clause just one more wedge, driven by a monarch who meant well, but miscalculated the depth of pain behind the palace walls? One thing is clear. The clock is ticking, and in just the last 2 minutes, the future of the Sussex legacy has been put on hold. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the last truth someone leaves behind isn't shouted from a balcony, but whispered inside an envelope, sealed with trembling hands? That's exactly what King Charles faced just days after Queen Elizabeth's passing. Not a royal directive, not a speech for the cameras, not even a list of ceremonial preferences for her funeral, but an envelope, cream-colored, heavier than it looked. Tucked beneath her personal diary, inside her writing desk at Balmoral, unmarked, except for one thing, a wax seal bearing the insignia not of the crown, but of a rose. Her favorite. No one, not even her most trusted aides, had ever seen that seal used on official documents. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't palace-approved. It was something else entirely. So when the desk was opened, quietly, carefully, and without the press nearby, this envelope felt different. And for Charles, what was inside would rattle the fragile foundation of his new reign. Because this wasn't just another ceremonial gesture from a monarch planning for the end. It was a message, a coded plea, a ticking emotional time bomb. And no one was prepared for what it said. Let's rewind for a second. When Queen Elizabeth died, the world mourned. But behind closed doors, the palace was in motion. Every drawer, vault, and safe was opened, catalogued, and cross-checked. Royal tradition demands order even in grief. And yet, when it came to Balmoral, there was one room staff were ordered to leave untouched for 72 hours, her private study. A space she guarded fiercely. The one room she never allowed aides to linger in, where she wrote her own Christmas cards, made handwritten edits to speeches, and penned letters, real letters, with her favorite Parker pen. It was here that Charles, alone, opened the top drawer of her writing desk. And there it was, an envelope. Thick, and addressed. To be opened by my son, Charles, and no one else. He knew the handwriting instantly. A mother's cursive. Graceful, delicate, and unmistakably firm. He broke the seal, and what he read made him sit down. Inside, Queen Elizabeth had written just 3 pages. No titles, no headings, no legal formatting. Just emotion. Raw, quietly pleading. She began with a reflection. On family, on legacy, on pain. She admitted, in her own words, that the royal family had fractured more deeply than she ever imagined possible. She spoke of sleepless nights, of tears she refused to let fall in public, and of watching Harry grow distant, not just in geography, but in spirit. She didn't point fingers. She didn't blame Meghan. She didn't absolve the monarchy. She simply wrote what she felt. There is love still in our family, but it has been buried beneath pride. And then came the clause. The sentence Charles would read over and over again. Should my grandson Harry and his wife Meghan wish to claim their inheritance, they must first make meaningful peace with the Prince of Wales and his father, the King. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children. Just one line. No explanation. No footnote. But everything changed with that line. Charles folded the letter, then unfolded it again. He didn't speak for nearly an hour, according to a close aide who stood quietly outside the door. When he finally emerged, the aide noticed his eyes were red. But the new king simply said, "Keep this away from the lawyers." For now, he wasn't ready. Not ready to face the clause, not ready to act on it, and certainly not ready to reveal it to William, or worse, to Harry. Because how do you tell your sons that their grandmother used her final act to condition forgiveness? Is that wisdom? Or cruelty? Love or leverage? That's the contradiction Charles couldn't untangle. And yet, the most chilling part wasn't the clause itself. It was what came after. On the final page, the Queen added a footnote, almost an afterthought. She mentioned a box. Not a vault. Not a chest. Just the small blue box beneath my wedding photograph. Charles raced back to her bedroom. He knew the photo. The famous one. The one of her and Philip, laughing in the Scottish countryside. And yes, beneath it was a small, powder blue jewelry box. Unlocked. Inside it, a smaller envelope. This one addressed not to Charles, but to William. And another, to Harry. Both unopened. Both bearing the rose seal. Charles didn't touch them. He simply stared. Then, wordlessly, he placed the box inside the Queen's traveling satchel, the one she carried to every family event, and locked it away in Windsor. He wasn't ready. He didn't even know if the boys would want to read them. Because now, every word carried weight. Every phrase was a ripple in a storm that had barely begun to settle. So why did the Queen do it? Why write something so potentially explosive? So conditional? Some say it was desperation. A final act of hope. She had watched her family crumble, from Andrew's scandals, to Meghan and Harry's exile, to Charles and William barely exchanging full conversations without royal protocol buffering the silence. The Queen didn't live in fantasy. She knew her family was broken, but she also believed, truly, that the bond between brothers could be healed. She believed that one day, they'd sit together at Balmoral again, laughing, without cameras, without Netflix, without lawyers, just them. And maybe, just maybe, she thought a gentle nudge in the will would help that along. Not a threat, not a command, a wish. And therein lies the danger. Because the line between encouragement and manipulation is razor thin. Especially when it comes wrapped in millions. Let's be honest here. This isn't just about reconciliation. It's about legacy, control, power, and perhaps a grandmother's need to make peace from beyond the veil. But what about Harry? He hasn't read the letter yet. Charles hasn't sent it. Not because he's hiding it, but because he's terrified of what comes next. Will Harry see it as betrayal? As a trap? Will Meghan accuse the Queen of weaponizing the children's future? Or worse? Will the letter be ignored completely? Because there's a silence now. A painful, humming silence between the brothers that no clause, no check, no royal decree has broken. And yet, tucked in a drawer in Windsor, are words that could either mend everything or shatter what little is left. And here's the twist no one saw coming. The clause? It wasn't witnessed by legal advisors. It wasn't notarized. It wasn't formally included in the Queen's binding estate documents. But Charles is treating it as sacred. He has refused to issue payment of the final trust intended for the Sussex children. He has paused the disbursement of assets tied to the Queen's private holdings that were earmarked for Harry. Why? Because, as he reportedly told his solicitor, "If I dishonor her words, I dishonor her memory." Even if he doesn't agree with the clause, he won't erase it. So now we're left with this. 2 envelopes. 2 brothers. One final plea from a queen who ruled longer than most of us have been alive. And the question that haunts every corner of the palace halls today: what happens if they ignore her? Because forgiveness can't be forced. Love can't be bought. And even a queen's final wish might be too late. But just as Charles tucked the blue box away, something strange happened. One of the royal archivists, tasked with cataloging the Queen's personal effects, discovered something odd. A second envelope. This one. Unsigned. Typed. Not handwritten. But identical in its message. And tucked behind it, a note from the Queen's most trusted advisor. A note that simply read, in case she changed her mind. What came next would unravel everything Charles thought he understood about his mother's final days. How do you carry out a dying wish when doing so could destroy the very thing you were crowned to protect? That was the impossible question King Charles faced as he sat alone in the Queen's study, letter in hand, silence pressing in from every ornate wall of Balmoral Castle. The clause wasn't just emotional. It was destabilizing. It was, in Charles's eyes, a beautiful poison, laced with sentiment but lethal in implication. And the worst part? It came from her. The one person in the world he trusted never to manipulate family for political ends. The one whose word had always been sacred, steady, unshakable. Queen Elizabeth. Now, her handwritten clause sat like a landmine in his lap. Should my grandson Harry and his wife Meghan wish to claim their inheritance, they must first make meaningful peace with the Prince of Wales and his father, the King. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children. But Charles couldn't look at that sentence without hearing the unspoken translation. You are the gatekeeper now. And he hated it. The days following the Queen's funeral were a blur of protocol, parades, and polished speeches. Charles moved through them like a man rehearsing a role he never truly wanted. Yes, he had prepared. Yes, he had trained. But he had also hoped, deep down, that the day might never come. Now here he was, King of the United Kingdom, and custodian of a family in ruins. Privately, he confided in one of his oldest friends, a former bishop, saying, "It's like being handed a house made of glass and told to dance inside it." But it wasn't just glass. It was fire. Because the clause had ignited something in Charles, a mixture of rage, sorrow, and fear. Rage that the Queen had placed this burden on him. Sorrow that Harry had drifted so far, so fast. And fear. Fear that if he honored this clause, he might never see his sons in the same room again. Because, let's be clear, this wasn't a reconciliation clause. It was a loyalty test. And Charles had always failed those. He failed them with Diana. He failed them with Camilla. And now, as king, he was expected to pass the ultimate test, reuniting a family fractured by years of betrayal, books, interviews, and silence. But can any father do that? Especially one who, let's not forget, is still reeling from his own role in the fallout. Let's talk about that for a moment. Because while Harry and Meghan have taken most of the public heat, Charles has never been entirely innocent in this drama. Remember the stories? How he allegedly refused to take Harry's calls after Megxit. How Meghan claimed she was denied mental health support during her time inside the firm. How the royal family, by silence or strategy, let accusations simmer without public defense. Charles may have watched, helpless, as the family crumbled, but at times, he also helped build the very walls that kept Harry out. So now, imagine being asked to enforce a clause demanding peace, when you still haven't apologized for the war. That's Charles's dilemma. And the clock is ticking. 2 days after discovering the clause, Charles summoned a meeting at Clarence House. Just 4 people attended. Camilla, Queen Consort. Sir Edward Young, former private secretary to the Queen, a royal solicitor, and Charles himself. The room was silent as Charles laid the clause on the table. No one spoke at first. Then, Sir Edward leaned forward and asked, "Was this meant to be binding?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, walked to the window, and whispered. It was meant to be heard. That changed the tone entirely. Because here's the thing. This clause wasn't legally enforceable. It wasn't part of the formal will submitted to court. It was a personal request, written in ink, not law. But Charles wasn't concerned about legality. He was worried about legacy. And even more terrifying, optics. Imagine the headlines. Charles freezes Harry's inheritance, demands public reconciliation. Queens will used as bait for royal reunion. Family or fortune. Sussex is caught in monarchy's emotional trap. It would look cold, calculated, cruel. But if he ignored it, Charles ignores Queen's final wish. Emotional clause in Queen's will disregarded by King. Was the Queen's final plea doomed to die in silence? He was trapped. Damned if he honored it. Damned if he ignored it. Even Camilla, usually the pragmatic one, was shaken. She meant this, Charles, she reportedly said that evening, over whiskey in the drawing room. She wrote it for a reason. You can't dismiss her heart because it wasn't legal. But Charles didn't answer. Because deep down, he didn't know what he feared more. Losing Harry forever, or forcing him back under false terms. And then came William. Charles had put off telling his eldest son about the clause. He didn't want the wound reopened. But secrets don't survive long in palaces. William was briefed by an aide. And when he heard the clause, he didn't flinch. He clenched his jaw, looked down at the floor, and muttered. So now we're offering bribes? Charles tried to explain, tried to frame it as a message of hope, not leverage. But William wasn't having it. He made his choices, William snapped. And so did she. He meant Meghan. And that's when Charles realized something terrible. The clause didn't just risk pushing Harry away, it could push William too. Because the idea of reconciliation wasn't a neutral dream. For William, it was betrayal. That night, Charles returned to his private quarters. He didn't sleep. He paced. He read the clause again. And then, he did something no one expected. He wrote his own letter. Not to Harry. Not to William. To the Queen. Yes, he wrote to her. On personal stationery. No official seal. Just emotion. And pain. He wrote, You've left me with a task I may not be strong enough to complete. I don't know if they will forgive each other. I don't know if they even want to. And I fear that honoring your wish will only deepen the wounds you hope to heal. But I will try. Because you believed in something I've forgotten how to hold on to. Hope. He folded the letter. Slipped it into the same satchel that held the envelopes for William and Harry. And locked it away again. But even after pouring out his feelings, he still didn't know what to do. Then, just when Charles was about to shelf the clause indefinitely, a phone call changed everything. From Montecito. A private number. Harry. For the first time in over 2 months, he was calling. No aides. No press. No PR filters. Just father and son. Charles answered on the second ring. And before he could say a word, Harry said, I heard there's something she left behind. For me. Charles froze. How did he know? Was it leaked? Was it Camilla? Was it someone from the Will team? But Harry's voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even cold. It was curious, quiet, almost hopeful. And that's when Charles made the decision. He told him. He read the clause aloud, just once. There was silence on the other end. Long, painful. Then Harry spoke. She always knew how to make things complicated, didn't she? Another silence. And then he said something Charles didn't expect. Send it. Just that. No conditions. No rebuttals. No anger. Send it. And for the first time in days, Charles felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the Queen died. Relief. But the relief was short-lived. Because after hanging up, Charles received a message. Not from Harry. From Meghan. One line. We won't be guilt-tripped into performing family for money. And just like that, the weight returned. Only now, the stakes had doubled. One son willing to listen. One wife unwilling to bend. And one clause, splitting them both in two. What Charles did next would decide not only the fate of Harry's inheritance, but the entire legacy of the Queen's final words. What would you do if someone dangled your children's future in front of you, with strings attached? Would you smile and say thank you? Would you fall in line for the sake of peace? Or would you stare them down and say, not like this, not anymore? Because when Meghan Markle read the clause, Queen Elizabeth's final, handwritten condition tying inheritance to reconciliation, it didn't feel like a kind nudge. It felt like a trap. A beautiful, velvet-wrapped trap. crafted not in cruelty, but in control, one that bore the scent of roses but carried the weight of centuries. To some, it was a loving grandmother's plea for unity. But to Meghan, it was something else entirely. A test, and not one she was eager to take. When Harry first told her about the clause, Meghan was silent. According to sources close to the couple, she listened without interrupting. She let him speak. Let him read the sentence. Let him explain how Charles had discovered it. And when he finished, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just asked one question. Did they leave anything for my mother? And that question tells you everything about how Meghan processes pain. Because for Meghan, the royal family isn't just an institution. It's a reminder of the phone calls that were never returned, of the security that was pulled, of the endless stories leaked to tabloids, stories that somehow always made her the villain. And most of all, it's a reminder of how she was welcomed into the firm with gloved hands and tight smiles, only to be left out in the cold when things got complicated. So now, years later, to be told that her children's inheritance, the legacy she thought they were entitled to as royal blood, was conditional? She didn't just see the Queen's handwriting. She saw a pattern, and she was done. But before we assume too much, let's zoom in on her perspective. This is a woman who walked away from the palace not because she didn't love Harry, but because the system, in her eyes, became unbearable. She'd tried. Really. She'd given up her career, her country, and her voice to become the Duchess. And in return, she was labeled difficult, untrustworthy, even dangerous. By the time she sat down with Oprah in 2021, Meghan wasn't just wounded. She was furious. And for many women watching that interview, something clicked. This wasn't just a duchess complaining about royal life. This was a woman standing up and saying, "You don't get to control me anymore." So now, after everything, to receive a message from beyond the grave, implying that her family's financial future depends on reconciling with people who, in her view, never properly reconciled with her, that wasn't healing. It was hypocrisy. Privately, Meghan spoke to a close friend, someone who's been with her since her Suits days. That friend, speaking anonymously, revealed something chilling. She said, "I love the Queen. I really did. But this clause, this conditional love, it's everything I fought to protect my kids from." That says it all. Because for Meghan, this wasn't about titles, not about palaces or pearls. It was about safety. Safety from manipulation, from toxic patterns, from a system that she believes devours people like her. And let's not forget, the Queen may have penned this clause, but the message to Meghan was crystal clear. You're not really family unless you fall back in line. And falling in line, that's not Meghan Markle's style. Still, it wasn't that simple. Because while Meghan may have felt disgusted, Harry felt torn. He sat in the garden of their Montecito estate for hours after reading the letter. Meghan watched him from the kitchen window, said nothing, gave him space, because she knew this wasn't just a royal clause. This was a mother-shaped wound being reopened. Harry wanted to believe the clause was love. He wanted to believe the Queen still saw him, cared for him, believed in him. But Meghan? She saw the political chessboard, and in her eyes, the Queen had just moved a pawn, right in front of their children. And here's where things get complicated. Because for all her defiance, for all her independence and media savvy, Meghan is also a mother. And Archie and Lilibet, they were mentioned. Specifically, not in legal terms, but emotionally. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children. Those 7 words changed the tone entirely. Because now, the Queen wasn't just talking about Harry and William. She was talking about Archie and Lilibet growing up without cousins, without uncles, without family holidays, without a place in the legacy of the crown. And Meghan? She's not immune to that. For days, she and Harry didn't speak of the clause. They simply existed, co-parented, gardened, held hands during Archie's preschool drop-offs, took walks in the Montecito hills. But in the quiet moments, that sentence hummed in the background like a threat wrapped in silk. One evening, Meghan sat down with her laptop and began writing. No one knows exactly what she typed, but sources close to her suggest it was a letter, possibly to Charles, maybe even to William, or to the Queen, not as a rebuttal, not as an attack, but as a final word. The kind you write when you're done being interpreted, when you want your truth to live in your own handwriting. There's a theory among royal watchers that Meghan's silence is strategic. That by refusing to react publicly, she's denying the firm the drama it secretly craves. But those close to her say it's not strategy. It's protection. She's protecting Harry from spiraling, protecting her children from being pawns in a royal script, and most of all, protecting herself from slipping back into the role of the outsider trying to fit in. Because she's not trying anymore. Not to win back favor. Not to please the press. Not to patch things up with a family that, in her eyes, never protected her when it mattered. So when Charles asked, through an aide, if she would be open to a private discussion about the clause, her response was sharp and final. If peace is conditional, it's not peace. But don't mistake her resolve for coldness. There are moments, rare ones, where the wall drops. Like the night Harry found her on the patio, crying quietly, holding a framed photo of the Queen holding baby Archie. She was kind to me, Meghan whispered. I don't know why she ended it like this. Harry didn't respond. He just sat beside her. Because the truth is, even now, they don't agree on what the clause meant. To Harry, it was a lifeline. To Meghan, it was a leash. And yet, the debate isn't over. Because a new question looms over their Montecito estate like a storm cloud. What will Archie and Lilibet think when they're old enough to understand? Will they see their parents as protectors? Or wonder if something, anything, could have been done to reconnect them to the world they were born into? To their cousins? To their grandfather? To the very family that erased their names from royal websites and stripped their father of security, but whose legacy still pulses through their blood? That's the quiet, aching dilemma Meghan carries now. Not how the world sees her, but how her children will. And whether this final clause from the Queen is the last royal tether she chooses to cut or hold. But the biggest twist? Meghan may not have the final say. Because Harry? He just made a phone call. Not to Charles. Not to William. But to someone who might be holding a second version of the clause. One not written by hand, but typed, edited, and signed. Someone who knows what the Queen was really planning in her final days. And what they reveal next. About Meghan, the clause, and the Queen's true intentions will shatter every assumption the world has made about this royal rift. What happens when a monarch's dying wish clashes with centuries of tradition, legal protocol, and buried royal secrets? What happens when a single handwritten clause becomes the most explosive document in Buckingham Palace? And more importantly, what if that clause was never meant to see the light of day? Because buried beneath the emotion, beyond the family drama, and hidden in the shadows of the Queen's rose-sealed envelope lies a truth more dangerous than any sibling feud. The clause might not be legally binding, and that fact, it could change everything. Let's step into the vaults of royal law, where secrets are stacked in silence and wills are guarded like nuclear codes. The British monarchy doesn't handle death the way ordinary families do. There are no tearful family readings over tea, no long tables with envelopes passed hand to hand. No, royal wills are sealed, literally. Since 1910, it has been tradition for the wills of senior royals to be kept confidential, sealed under the authority of a high court judge. Even now, the will of Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth's husband, is locked away in an undisclosed location, unseen by the public, and will remain so for 90 years. That's right, 9 decades. By the time most royal wills are unsealed, the people mentioned in them are either dead or irrelevant. But Queen Elizabeth? She broke form in her final act. The handwritten clause Charles discovered wasn't stored in the royal vaults. It wasn't catalogued with her estate. It wasn't witnessed by a court official. It was tucked into a drawer, quietly, privately, personally. And that small detail, though emotional, has now triggered a full-blown legal and constitutional crisis. Shortly after the clause was revealed to Charles, a trusted palace aide raised the alarm. He asked a simple, terrifying question. Who else knows about this clause? And where was it stored before Charles saw it? That one query sparked a chain reaction. First, royal solicitors were summoned to Windsor. Then, a legal inquiry was launched, internal, confidential, but very real. Because if the Queen had added new instructions, however informal, to her end-of-life documents, and those additions weren't included in the final estate filings, was the will tampered with? Or was it incomplete by design? And if incomplete, who decided which version would be filed and which version would be ignored? Let's follow the chain of custody. Step 1. After the Queen's death at Balmoral, All of her personal effects, letters, journals, keepsakes, were divided into three categories. Ceremonial property, passed to the crown. Private estate assets, under control of the executor. Unfiled personal correspondence, handled by the Queen's private secretary. This last category is where the trouble starts. Because the envelope Charles discovered was part of that third group, meaning it wasn't included in the official will submission to the probate office. And that's critical, because under UK law, only documents formally declared as testamentary can be acted upon legally. So on paper, the clause shouldn't have had any impact at all. But emotionally, it was everything. That's when the lawyers got involved. The Queen's legal advisor, an aging man who'd served her for nearly 4 decades, was called in. He arrived at Clarence's house with a locked briefcase and a look that, according to sources, could freeze a fireplace. Inside that briefcase, a second envelope, not sealed with a rose, not handwritten, typed, clean, clinical, and at the top, the words, Version B, Contingent Clause, Sussex Trust. Let that sink in. There were 2 versions of the clause, one emotional, one legal, and that revelation flipped the entire situation on its head. Because while Charles had been agonizing over the Queen's heartfelt handwritten plea, there had been another draft, a more calculated, more structured version, circulating behind the scenes. And it had never been signed. So who wrote it? Was it the Queen herself? Or was it a draft prepared by palace legal staff, based on her verbal wishes? That's where the waters grow murky. According to insiders, the document marked Version B was prepared 3 weeks before her death, around the same time as the rose-sealed letter Charles found. It was typed by her private legal secretary. But there was one chilling detail. The signature line was blank. No initials. No monogrammed stamp. Nothing. And in the margin, a note, scrawled in pen, not the Queen's usual handwriting. Do not send. May revisit after Sandringham. But the Queen never returned to Sandringham. She died at Balmoral just days later, meaning Version B was never finalized. And yet, somehow, it still made its way into the Queen's legal files. Why? And who put it there? At this point, the question isn't just about whether the clause was enforceable. It's about whether someone inside the palace was trying to quietly remove it, or whether someone was preparing to make it law before time ran out. That's the theory now spiraling through both royal circles and British government legal departments. Because while the Queen's handwritten letter was a personal request, Version B reads more like a binding condition, a formal declaration that the Sussex Trust assets be withheld until an observed reconciliation has been fulfilled, as determined by the reigning monarch. Let that sink in. As determined by the reigning monarch. That line essentially gives Charles full authority to interpret what reconciliation looks like and when it has happened. And that's dangerous, because it creates a constitutional gray zone. Charles is no longer just king. He becomes judge and jury over whether his estranged son gets access to his inheritance. And that much power, especially over something so personal, has never been seen in modern British history. So what are the legal teams doing now? Scrambling. There's now a quiet internal battle between 2 camps. Camp A. Enforce the Queen's emotional clause privately, without legal weight, allowing Charles to make the call in his own time. Camp B. Denounce both clauses as unenforceable, bury them from the public, and prevent constitutional fallout. The stakes? If Camp A wins, Harry and Meghan's inheritance remains frozen until Charles is satisfied with their reconciliation, if ever. If Camp B wins, the clause is effectively erased from history, and the funds are dispersed quietly, no drama, no spectacle. But there's a catch. Because Version B, while unsigned, was time-stamped and witnessed. 2 palace aides confirmed they saw the Queen reviewing the document, making notes, and murmuring aloud. I want to give them time, but not forever. That single quote, if verified, could shift the interpretation. Because now, royal lawyers are asking, was Version B the true clause, intended to be formalized, but cut short by the Queen's death? And if so, does the monarchy have a responsibility to carry it out? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry has caught wind of all of this. Through what source? No one's confirmed. But the moment Version B was mentioned in the UK press, only briefly, buried in paragraph 17 of an article on succession, Harry's legal team sent an immediate request for disclosure. The message was direct. We ask for full transparency regarding all versions of Queen Elizabeth II's testamentary materials relating to the Sussex Trust, including but not limited to personal correspondence, unofficial clauses, and unexecuted drafts. And that, dear viewer, is where things now stand. A clause that might not be legal, a trust that may not be distributed, and a king who never asked for this throne, now caught between his mother's pen and his son's pain. But the most shocking twist? One of the Queen's aides, who had quietly retired 6 months before her death, has just come forward with a diary, a personal record of her final weeks, lunches, conversations, scribbled notes, and in it, an entry marked just 6 days before her passing. Spoke to Charles about Harry. He still carries pain. Gave him the envelope. Told him, let it be your decision. You'll know when the time is right. Which means the clause may not have been a command after all. It may have been a final act of trust, one that Charles now holds in his hands. And he's running out of time to decide, because someone else just got access to that diary. And they're not part of the family. They're from Parliament. How do you define peace? Not in headlines, not in handshakes, but real, honest peace. That's the heart of the clause Queen Elizabeth left behind. Not about titles, not about thrones, but about something infinitely harder to measure and almost impossible to prove. Emotional reconciliation. That's the word she used. Meaningful peace. Not a staged photograph, not a royal press statement, but something felt, deep down, between father and sons, between brothers who hadn't looked each other in the eyes without clenched jaws in years. But here's the problem. How do you enforce an emotion? Because Queen Elizabeth didn't write a typical clause. She didn't say, Harry must apologize publicly. She didn't demand Meghan attend a Christmas at Sandringham. She didn't list conditions that could be ticked off by lawyers or palisades. She left something vague, something haunting. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children. But who gets to decide what whole means? Charles? William? The tabloids? Or worse, lawyers? Let's unpack what an emotional clause even is. In legal terms, it's unenforceable. It's not a will condition you can prove with paperwork. There's no inheritance officer knocking on doors, asking, have you hugged your brother today? Great, here's the trust fund. No court on earth recognizes peace as a financial trigger. And yet, here it is, sitting at the center of the biggest royal inheritance freeze in modern history. Why? Because it wasn't written for the courts. It was written for the heart. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Think about this. The Queen, known for her restraint, her quiet diplomacy, her ironclad ability to remain neutral in even the most explosive royal crises, chose her final moments to be deeply, emotionally specific. Why? Some say she saw the monarchy not just as a crown, but as a family. She watched her grandsons go from best friends to bitter strangers. She saw Harry walk behind her husband's casket in silence, flanked by William and Peter, with a gap between them wide enough to feel. And she knew no crown could survive another generation built on silence. So she tried something radical. She wrote her hopes into her will, not for political gain, but for love. But love, as it turns out, is messy, and when it's wrapped in millions of pounds in inheritance, extremely complicated. Let's talk numbers. Queen Elizabeth's personal wealth, excluding assets tied directly to the crown estate, was estimated at over £500 million. Of that, a large portion had been discreetly arranged into private family trusts, including the Queen Mother's Trust, Hall Legacy Fund, and more recently, a quiet Sussex-specific trust intended to benefit Harry's branch of the family. This trust, according to leaked documents, included an estate in Gloucestershire, several vintage royal jewelry pieces, a multi-million-pound endowment, divided equally between Archie and Lilibet. But since her passing, not a single pound of that trust has been disbursed. Why? Because the Queen's final emotional clause sits like a shadow over every financial instruction tied to the Sussex line. Even though the clause itself isn't legally binding, its existence has made the palace's legal and financial officers nervous. No one wants to be the one who ignores the Queen. Even in death, her influence looms. And here's where things get even messier. Because if Charles is the king, Why doesn't he just decide what peace looks like and move on? Simple. He can't. Not emotionally. Not morally. And most importantly, not publicly. Imagine the backlash if Charles declares, "Yes, Harry and Meghan have reconciled. Release the funds." The headlines would roar. Pay-for-play royal forgiveness. King sells reconciliation for cash. Sussexes buy their way back in. But if he says, "No, they haven't reconciled. Keep the money frozen," he's the villain. A father denying his own son's children their legacy. Either way, he loses. And William? His role is even more delicate. Because if peace requires his emotional agreement, then we're facing a cold reality. It may never happen. Sources inside Kensington Palace describe William's attitude toward Harry as frozen beyond repair. He's angry, not just about the Oprah fallout or spare, but about what he sees as years of betrayal dressed up as truth. And when he learned the clause tied inheritance to reconciliation, he didn't laugh. He didn't cry. He reportedly said, "She's asking for something we can't fake, and we can't feel. So if emotional reconciliation requires mutual healing, the clause is already doomed." And what about Harry? Where does he stand? In limbo. Because the man who once stormed out of royal life now finds himself waiting for a signal, for a phone call, for a softened look in his brother's eye that may never come. But here's what stings the most. He doesn't control the outcome. Even if Harry reaches out, even if he swallows his pride and says, "Let's fix this," it won't matter unless Charles and William accept it. Because this clause doesn't demand an effort toward peace. It demands a result. And how do you prove a result when the other side won't pick up the phone? There's an almost Shakespearean cruelty in this moment. The Queen wanted unity. She hoped to engineer it through grace, not force. But the very vagueness of her clause has turned hope into a battlefield. One brother is grieving. The other is waiting. And the man in the middle, the king, is paralyzed by fear of choosing wrong. And who suffers? Not the tabloids. Not the palace officials. The children, Archie and Lilibet. Two innocent names caught in a clause so fragile, so emotionally loaded, that no one dares define it, but no one can ignore it. Behind closed doors, there are whispers of compromise. Some palace aides have suggested a symbolic gesture be staged. A joint holiday photo at Sandringham. A private visit, unannounced, between William and Harry. A co-authored statement on childhood mental health, tying back to Diana's legacy. Something that looks like peace, even if it isn't. But Charles has resisted. He reportedly said, "If we perform forgiveness, we mock her." He means the Queen. Because Charles, for all his complications, understood what she wanted. Not optics, connection. But now he's stuck. Do nothing, and her wish dies. Force a fake peace, and her legacy is manipulated. So what does a king do? He waits. And that's exactly what Harry is no longer willing to do. Because just days ago, a new twist emerged. Harry, tired of the ambiguity, has hired a third-party mediator. Not a lawyer, not a therapist, a conflict resolution specialist. Someone outside the royal circle. Independent, neutral. Their job? To draft a report. A non-legally binding document stating that reasonable efforts toward reconciliation have been made by the Sussexes. The goal? To document that peace was attempted, even if not accepted. And what would that mean? A legal challenge. A request to release the inheritance, based not on emotion, but on intent. That move, it's already sparked panic at the palace. Because if this mediator's report goes public, it could paint Charles and William as the ones preventing peace, not Harry. And that would flip the narrative completely. So now, the emotional clause, the Queen's final, trembling hope, has become a weapon. Not through malice, but through misinterpretation. Because emotions can't be notarized. They can't be time-stamped or signed. They can only be felt. And that makes them both sacred and dangerously subjective. But this story is far from over. Because while Harry tries to prove peace, Meghan is preparing something else. A statement. Her first, and possibly only, public response to the clause. And what she says next could either reframe the entire narrative or burn the final bridge between Montecito and Windsor forever. What if the key to millions rested not in forgiveness, but in the clenched jaw of a future king? Because that's exactly where we are now. With all the drama swirling around Queen Elizabeth's clause, The inheritance, the emotional condition, the chaos of interpretation. There's one person who has said almost nothing publicly. No press statements. No interviews. No Instagram-worthy strolls through grief. Prince William. And yet, his silence is deafening. Because behind the calm exterior, beneath the tailored suits and polite nods to reporters, insiders say William is raging. Quietly. Internally. Intensely. And if this story were a chessboard, the Queen may have made the first move with her claws. But William? He might be preparing to flip the board entirely. Let's be brutally honest here. Of all the people impacted by the clause, the king, the Sussexes, the lawyers, the public, it's William who faces the most unspoken pressure. Why? Because the clause doesn't just call for reconciliation between Harry and Charles. It calls for peace between brothers. And that's a line the Queen never crossed before. Because for years, even when Megxit exploded, even when Oprah dropped like a bomb, even when Spare sliced through royal image like a scalpel, Elizabeth never publicly pushed William to forgive. She remained neutral, gracious, unmoving. But now, in her final personal letter, she made it clear. The family must be made whole again, not for the monarchy, but for the children. And that one line hit William like a punch to the chest. Because in his mind, the family was whole. It was Harry who walked away. Insiders say William's reaction to the clause wasn't shock. It was betrayal, not just of him as a man, but of his role as the one who stayed. Think about it. William was the one who never ran, never gave that interview, never broke rank. Even when the media painted his wife as cold, even when his brother lit the palace on fire from across the Atlantic, he was silent, loyal, stoic. And now, the Queen was asking him to reopen a wound that, in his words, had finally started to close. Here's what we know. When Charles first told William about the clause, William didn't respond immediately. He listened, nodded once, then stood up, walked to the window, and said, "She had no right to ask that of me." Charles was stunned. He tried to reason. "Your brother." But William cut him off. "He's not my brother anymore. He's a man who sold his soul to Netflix and called us racists on global television." Charles, ever the peacemaker, reminded him it was the Queen's wish. But William wasn't interested in wishes. He was interested in trust. And in his eyes, Harry shattered it. But it goes deeper than that. Because William isn't just Harry's brother. He's the heir. And for someone raised to understand duty above all else, forgiveness isn't just a personal struggle. It's a public responsibility. Every handshake, every smile, every reunion photo becomes a symbol. So if William fakes peace for the sake of a clause, the world takes that as truth. The press spins it. The firm sells it. Harry gets the inheritance. And William? He's the one who swallowed his pride for the cameras. Again. And that's why he's furious. Not just because the Queen asked for reconciliation, but because she didn't acknowledge what it would cost him to grant it. Dignity, memory, pain. Because, remember, the public doesn't know half of what went on behind the scenes. They don't know about the phone calls that ended in shouting, the text messages left unread, the Christmas invitations turned down. They don't know how Kate cried before the wedding, or how William had to mediate screaming matches between staff who quit in droves during the Sussexes' brief time in Kensington Palace. They only see headlines. But William? He lived the slow unraveling. So when the Queen asked him to act as if none of it happened, for the sake of the children, he didn't just feel unheard. He felt used. There's a saying in royal circles. The heir holds his tongue until the throne finds him. And William has lived by that. But now, there's a clause that threatens his silence. And those around him say the mask is slipping. Privately, he's expressed doubts not just about the Sussexes, but about the monarchy's decision to keep accommodating them. Every time we bend for Harry, he reportedly told a senior aide, we make it harder for the next generation to know what loyalty means. That generation, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and William above all, wants them raised without confusion about who the royal family really is. And then came the kicker. 1 week after the clause was leaked, a private letter arrived for William. Not from Charles, not from Harry, from Princess Anne. In it, she shared her thoughts on the clause. And she didn't hold back. Your grandmother was wise, but she was also a woman of sentiment. This clause is not strategy. It's sorrow. Don't mistake one for the other. Anne's message? Don't let grief rewrite your judgment. William, reportedly, read the letter 3 times, and then tore it in half, because now he sees the bigger picture. This isn't just about Harry. It's about control. If William gives in, even once, the precedent is set. Say whatever you want. Break away. Come back when it suits you. And the family will always welcome you, if the cameras are rolling. And that makes him livid, because it turns the monarchy into a reality show. And William? He spent his entire life trying to prove it's more than that. So when asked by a palace insider whether he would meet Harry for a quiet discussion, William reportedly replied, "Not until he retracts every word of that book. Spare. 200 pages of raw wounds. Half a dozen allegations. A lifetime of memories weaponized in hardback. And the Queen's clause? It made no mention of it. No condition to apologize. No reference to the memoir. Just reconciliation. And that omission? To William, it felt like betrayal. Here's the cruel paradox. The Queen thought she was building a bridge. But to William, she left him holding the wood, the nails, and the hammer, and demanded he build it, alone, while Harry stood on the other side, arms crossed, waiting. But there's one moment no one knows about. One that's never been reported. After the funeral, William was seen lingering by the Queen's casket. Everyone else had left. Just him. Alone. Aides say he whispered something. Just one sentence, before walking away. You should have trusted me to protect them. Them. The family. The crown. Even Harry. And now? Now he's left with a clause that tells him to undo everything he believes he was right to do. So what happens next? William has made no official statement, but sources confirm he's rejected all private outreach from Harry's legal team regarding demonstrations of reconciliation. In other words, he won't play along. No photo ops. No meetings. No symbolic forgiveness. Not yet. Not unless something drastic happens. And guess what? Something's coming. Because Harry's next move isn't an apology. It's a visit. Unannounced. Uninvited. Back to the UK. Just him. Not Meghan. Not the kids. Just a man, and a letter from the Queen in his pocket. The letter William hasn't seen. Yet. And when those two brothers meet again, it won't be a reunion. It'll be a reckoning. What if the Queen's final plea wasn't aimed at her sons, but at the two smallest heirs who don't even understand what they've inherited? Because at the heart of all this, beneath the legal wrangling, the silent wars, the press spin, and the emotional debris, is Archie and Lilibet. Two children, born of a royal bloodline, but raised in a world of sunshine, chickens, and Montecito privacy. Their names appear in the Queen's clause not as pawns, not as heirs, not as titles, but as a reason. The family must be made whole again. Not for the monarchy, but for the children. That single line wasn't poetic. It was deliberate, because Queen Elizabeth knew something the world is only now starting to grasp. The future of the monarchy isn't held by thrones or scepters. It's in the tiny hands of children who barely know their lineage. And if the family remains fractured, so too will that future. But here's where it gets devastating. Because for all the debate about inheritance, forgiveness, and public perception, no one, not Charles, not William, not even Harry, can guarantee what kind of royal future Archie and Lilibet will even want, or whether they'll want one at all, because their lives have been shaped outside the walls of the palace, outside the rules, outside the guilt, but not outside the shadow. And that's what the Queen saw coming. Let's go back. When Archie was born, there was hope. Hope that he might be a symbol of a modern monarchy. Biracial, beloved, and bridging a gap between old tradition and a new, global generation. But almost immediately, cracks formed. Controversies over title, over christening location, over the refusal to name godparents. And then, the security scandal. Harry and Meghan claimed publicly that Archie was denied security due to his lack of royal title, an allegation that sparked a firestorm. Then Lilibet arrived, named after the Queen herself, a gesture many believed was a peace offering. But it backfired. Why? Because no one in the family was consulted about the name. Not William, not Charles, not even the Queen. The gesture that was supposed to soften the divide only deepened it. And from that moment on, it was clear. Archie and Lilibet were not going to be folded neatly into the royal story. But the Queen, in private, never gave up. Sources close to her describe moments when she would request new photos of the